Everybody, glad to see you here. My name is Dr. Robert Williamson. Some folks call me Bobby, so some folks call me Dr. Williamson. So feel free, whichever way is best for you. Unless you're my student, in which case I'm Dr. Williamson. I am a professor in the Religious Studies Department here at Hendrix, and also the director of the Interfaith Initiative, which is an office in our office of within our Office of Religious Life that focuses on interfaith community on campus. When we say interfaith at Hendrix, we are following closely behind the Interfaith Youth Corps model. So what we mean by that is a place that is a space that is itself religiously neutral, but we're interested in conversations about religion. So the Interfaith Initiative is not a Methodist place like Hendrix College is. We are a place that is invested in the conversation among people who identify differently around religion. And when we say that at Hendrix, we mean people who have a particular religious tradition, people who are a mix of different religious traditions, people who are between religious traditions, people who have a spirituality that they don't name in any particular way, people who are atheists, and people who are non-religious. We think, along with IBU and IFYC, that when we get all those people together and we learn how to appreciate and understand each other and work together, if we can learn how to do that in our small spaces, we can learn how to do that in our communities, and then in our state, and then in our nation, and then in our world. So that's what we mean here. I realize that interfaith is a vexed word, and different folks relate to it differently, and some folks may use different words, or some folks may use that word and mean something different. But that's what we mean here. This conference today is possible because of Interfaith Youth Corps. They have a series of grants that schools can apply for to do regional conferences. And so that is what we're doing today, is an Interfaith Youth Corps sponsored regional interfaith conference. And so we are deeply grateful for all of you for committing your schools and yourselves to be a part of today, and for showing up despite the weather. We are quite a bit smaller than the registration, and so on a positive side, I think that means we can have some in-depth and more intimate conversation and set the groundwork for the future. What we're really hoping we're doing is continuing some work that has happened between our campuses in the past, and maybe creating a focal point where we could have these regional conferences periodically or even annually, maybe hosted by different institutions. If you were willing, we could come see you next year. So we'll talk about that as we go. In addition to Interfaith Youth Corps, today's conference is co-hosted by the Hendrix Interfaith Initiative, which I direct, by the Hendrix Project Pericles, which is interested in public advocacy, directed by Dr. Jay Barth, who teaches in our politics department, among many other things that he does for us. The Marshall T. Steele Center for the Study of Religion and Philosophy, which is represented today by Professor John Sanders, who's here on the front row, and the Office of Religious Life here at Hendrix. I want to make sure, before the day gets away, just to say thanks to a couple folks. In addition to Professor Barth and Professor Sanders, we have a set of Hendrix staff and student workers who have been instrumental in making this happen. Tammy Vanneman and Trisha Burris, Jorge Astorga and Annie Meek in particular, and also all of our Hendrix ambassadors who are wearing the cool little tags, flags on their name tag. I don't know if they're cool, but they're distinctive. Anyway. I also want to thank, in particular, Dr. Sanders for organizing the visit from Professor Volf. We had a long day yesterday of activities in various classes, and last evening I know some of you were there with Professor Volf, and John is the one who made that happen, so we're very grateful for that. I also want to say a particular word of thanks to Dr. Jay McDaniel, who is a member of the Religious Studies Department here at Hendrix. Dr. McDaniel was doing interfaith before interfaith was cool. He may be one of the people who made it cool, I'm not sure. But he was doing Christian-Buddhist dialogue all the way back early in his career. And so he has really created a toehold for interfaith here at Hendrix long before that was a thing that people were doing. I organized a class on multi-faith leadership that I put on the books last spring, and then I organized this conference, and then my wife and I got pregnant, and I went on family leave. And so Dr. McDaniel has taken over a lot of work that probably he was not expecting to, but he's been very gracious about it, and so thank you, Jay. The basic flow of the day is this morning we'll have some time with Professor Volf to hear some of his wisdom about interfaith and then to have some conversation with him. There will be a panel later this morning of folks doing interfaith work in local communities. And then this afternoon will be led by the Arkansas Public Policy Panel, who are going to do some trainings with us about how to create advocacy groups around certain issues in our local communities. So there's a lot going on today. We'll have some time for conversation over lunch and then other times. Anything I left out? All right. So this morning, our speaker is Dr. Miroslav Volf. Professor Volf is the Henry B. Wright Professor of Systematic Theology and the founding director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. He is a native of Croatia and did his doctoral work at the University of Tübingen in Germany and has now been teaching at Yale for quite some time. So he has a lot of experience in theological conversations around the world. He's the author of a number of influential books which have their roots in Christian theology but have been branching out in all kinds of directions through the course of his career. He has a long and abiding interest in interfaith work and in the role of religion in creating a just and equitable society. His most recent book is called Flourishing: Why We Need Religion in a Globalized World. In that book, he's thinking about religion as both a great danger to humanity and also religion as holding great promise for humanity in terms of our flourishing. And he is interested in that intersection of religion and globalization. On a personal note, I learned yesterday that Professor Volf also has a 3-month-old daughter who was born 2 days before my daughter. So I was at home with my daughter last night, which is why I'm looking weary. And Dr. Volf was here in a room by himself last night, which is why he is looking particularly upbeat this morning. So please join me in welcoming Professor Miroslav Volf.
What am I doing here? Losing all my wisdom. And in the meantime, turning on my phone to a light. Just give me a bit. I'm normally not as disorganized. And actually, I shouldn't be, right? Because I slept for about 9 hours. It doesn't happen. First, can you hear me well? Okay, there we go. So I'm delighted to be able to be here with you. My own engagement with interfaith is partly biographical conditioned. I grew up in a country which had a sizable Muslim population in former Yugoslavia, with long history of Turkish and therefore also Islamic Muslim occupation of the region, but also in the more recent years, and what immediately triggered some of my work was a war in former Yugoslavia, in which obviously the two major Christian groups were clashed, representing each standing for a particular ethnic community, Serbian and Croatian, Eastern and Catholic, and there's also a Muslim minority who was part of that conflict. Muslims there being converts to Islam, of Slavic background, converts to Islam during these 500 years of occupation. So you had a very interesting mixture of religious convictions clashing and being tied with other investments that we might have, political, economic, cultural, ethnic, and so forth. Kind of the other context in which I worked on the interfaith was I was teaching for a number of years a course at Yale entitled Faith and Globalization. And this book, which Dr. Williams has mentioned, Flourishing, Why We Need Religion in a Globalized World, grew out of that course. And the reason I'm mentioning some of these things is that this conditions kind of a way in which I think about religious traditions. On the one hand, I approach it from a very personal standpoint of a person who experienced friendships and enmities between people of various religious traditions. But on the other hand, I'm always interested in what's happening on at the global level, larger political and global level. And some of this might or might not immediately resonate with your sets of concerns, but on the other hand, I think those things tend to be intertwined, interconnected, and you may be able, or we may be able together to then explore how that might concretely apply to the situations in which you find yourselves. So today, I was going to address the question that I think is in many parts of the world, also in many communities in this country, I find very relevant. And that question is that religious traditions make certain kinds of truth claims. And these truth claims, generally, and I'll try to expound on this a little bit more. I think I'm going to leave my notes. I have typed up about 35 pages. You want me to read that stuff to you? I think it'll be better off if I speak to you. I might occasionally I'll look down to remind myself and maybe read you a passage or two, but I think it'll be better off if I speak to you. So the religious traditions on the whole, I think that's not true universally and without exception. But religious traditions, even kind of secular accounts of the good life that were mentioned here as a part of interfaith, they make truth claims, a certain kind of truth claims. And often the difficulty is that these truth claims kind of clash, and therefore also, with many other reasons contributing, but therefore also people making those truth claims clash with one another and need to find ways in which to kind of negotiate those claims. And these truth claims aren't simply about abstract matters or matters of facts that can be very easily settled by fact check, although what am I talking about? It should be possible in our political environment today to fact check things, and people do fact check things, and nonetheless it doesn't matter because of certain kinds of investment that we have, existential investment that we have in certain facts being, well, certain things being deemed, or certain perspectives being deemed as facts, which most of us know that they aren't. But at any rate, so this kind of clashing perspectives is, I think, a very significant experience. Now, the way I propose to do this is to kind of give you an example of a religion that you're very familiar with, the Christian faith, and the kind of universal claims it makes. Then I'm going to go into a kind of one possible and significant objection that I think we should kind of push aside and kind of negotiate around, and then deal specifically with clashing, what I call clashing universalisms. And this objection that ought to be pushed aside is sometimes people are making a claim that religious traditions or any views that articulate in a positive way a vision are by very nature exclusive, and therefore on account of exclusivism we should undertake something like a mere negative critiques or delineations rather than affirmation of positives, right? In other words, this kind of prepares for the position that I'm going to advocate, namely that the problem with religious traditions is not that they make truth claims, There may be other problems. The problem is how they make those truth claims. That may be a kind of that may require, and I will argue, it requires kind of reconceptualizing how we think about neutral spaces, as you mentioned, how we think about polity in the neutral spaces, how we think about education, and that's where I'm going to then end. So let me just start with a brief sketch to give you a sense of what I mean by most religious traditions making universal claims. I think one such vision of flourishing life, one such religion is Christianity, and it makes kind of claim to be universally valid. It's addressed to every person, and it's addressed to the entire world. And the visions that it has seem to be universal. Things in terms of new creation. Well, what can be more universal than new creation? At the end of the book of Revelation, last book of the Bible, it thinks about this heavenly city. There's some folks that are not quite there yet, maybe. But nonetheless, it's universal as well. We can talk about each of these issues. Or the kingdom of God is a universal reality, of home of God. So, variety of universal visions. And not only that, that you have a kind of this single vision that applies to all human beings, even though that vision may be very, very capacious. Also, the claim is made that because creatures, especially human beings, are interdependent, it's also true that for one person to flourish, the entire world must flourish. And for the entire world to flourish, all people in it have to flourish. Now that position, and you may contest that position, but that position too requires a certain kind of universality. So it requires the conditions, common conditions, in which the entirety of interdependent creatures would be able to flourish. This is not just a feature of Christian account of truly, fully flourishing life, something like Marxian account. Marx would claim the same, just about the same thing. Communism has to be a universal reality. We have these partial realizations. They're not going to undermine each other, but they're not going to be able to be what they are supposed to be because they lack the large universality. And in the Christian tradition, that's being underwritten by the belief in one God. One God is the source of all of reality, source of all creatures, and is the God, therefore, of the entirety of the creation. And corresponding in the Bible, Jesus Christ, the Word that created all things, enlightens also every person. So you have this idea that Christian faith is one way of life that's true for all, even if it may be true that each person walks that way in their own way. Or the destination is common, even though, as Gospel of John says, there are many mansions. There are many varieties, you can maybe interpret this, of the ways of living this. Now, from one angle, you can say that this universality is something like all-encompassing inclusivity, right? Everybody's included. Well, except that everybody is included on the same terms, right? And then the obverse of that universality is a certain kind of exclusivity. You can put it in terms of Christian faith in the one God. The obverse of the faith in one God is kind of claim that what doesn't fit under the realm of that God, and those who do not affirm the belief in one God are in some ways missing what is true at the most fundamental level. And this is true not just of Christian monotheism, it's true also of all other monotheisms, and you can see it, this kind of gesture of negation, of exclusion. You can see that in the way in which each of these monotheisms is formulated in a very pithy way. Now I should say, there are kind of monotheism that are all-inclusive, that they don't contain negation. And those monotheisms may be something claiming that all things are divine, right? Something like pantheism might be that kind of all-inclusive monotheism, but most monotheisms aren't such. Most monotheisms are exclusive. Not all gods are one, but no God but one. Right? That's the formulation. And you have it, that's a typical, it's an almost direct quote from the formulation of the Confession of Faith, Profession of Faith of Islam. No God but God. Those are the first words that are most basic of Islamic professions of faith. It's true also of Judaism as well. First and very basic commandment of Judaism, you shall have no other gods besides me, right? So no God besides me, you have, again, a kind of gesture of exclusion. And in Christianity, it's no different because it builds on Judaism. And Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, no God but one, right? So the identity of that God is the only God. And so the necessary verse of that affirmation is a certain negation. One true God has to be distinguished from any false gods. And then you've got the problem, interfaith problem, on your hands, right? So how does one live and inhabit common space, or how does one, what I sometimes say, live under the same political roof while at the same time giving allegiances to at least different conception even of that one God, or affirming one God while saying that worship that other people give or ultimate value that other people have may turn out to be false gods. Now, lots of people think that these days, I think that's a traditional view of those religious traditions. Lots of people these days feel, and that complicates the matter, especially in, let's put it as complicated, partly eases up to the matters in a contemporary setting. Because a lot of people today believe that true and false are not to be applied to the domain of religion at all. Right? Religions are not necessarily true or false. We assess religions. We apply to religions different criteria. We may apply to religions aesthetic criteria. We may apply to religion's utilitarian criteria. It may be, we can place a religion on the spectrum between attractive and repugnant, useful, or not just utterly useless, but positively harmful, or something of that sort. And we do the same thing about accounts of flourishing, visions of the purposes of human lives more generally. And there is a sentiment fairly prevalent, not universally present, but fairly prevalent, that religion or other kind of vision of life may be good for me and true for me, but may not be good for you or true for you or someone else. Or it may be good for me today, but need not be good for me tomorrow, so that I can make those decisions depending on my situation and aesthetic, as well as kind of utilitarian considerations. So that the question of truth comes out of the window. It's a question of what I desire and what's useful to me now, and we let then the question of truth apply simply to sciences. There is no truth. Sciences are about what's true and what's false, and sciences are not about what should be desired. Scientists may tell you what people in fact desire, but the fact that people desire, that doesn't mean that that ought to be desired, right? And so sciences can tell you a lot about what's going on in the world of religion, but they can't tell you much about where you ought to go with your life, though they may give you information that you might need along the way in order to kind of achieve the goal that you have set for yourself, or maybe even to set the course slightly differently than you thought that you ought to go. Religious traditions are tough for us today, partly because of that sensibility, right? Because classical religious traditions, they make claims to know where we ought to be going, and they make claims that there ought to be kind of a tables of values according which we should evaluate what we should desire. Nietzsche used the term tables of values, and he saw himself as inventing new tables of values because he was inventing a new type of a human being. A kind of a type of a human being is embedded in a particular vision, I think, of a flourishing life, and that makes it for us problematic because we tend to think that the direction of our lives is completely at our disposal, and hence we get to be often divided by those religious traditions, either because they clash firmly against each other, or because each and all together clash with the sensibility that you ought not mess with my life. I should be able to lead my life the way I want. And that's a kind of, in a very maybe flippant way, a description of the situation of religions, great world religions, in the situation today, especially in the West. So that's a little bit of introduction and background. And let me say a few words about this idea of religions making a claim, making positive claims about vision, how we ought to lead our lives, and what human beings ought to think of themselves as human beings. Now that we kind of push significantly against that idea because we think that it's an exclusive position, and often what we tend to do is, in order to manage the plurality, we emphasize the kind of critique and the negative. So what we can do is we can critique exclusion, we can critique suffering, we can critique various modes of living that tend to be harmful we perceive as harmful to others. So basic rule then ends up being, you shall do no harm to other people. Once you have a position, you should do no harm, you are able then to practice and imagine your life in the way in which you might want to pursue yourself. And the question is whether that's sustainable. And my argument would be, that's obviously open for debate, my argument would be that position is not actually sustainable. That behind every negation, that behind every kind of critique of a vision of, say, flourishing life, lies implicit positive vision of a flourishing life. That may be a vision of a person as autonomous subject who defines his own or her own life. It may be of the form, and it will probably be of the social relations, how such autonomous subjects can negotiate their ways in the common space, or it may be something about the good that each of them ought to be pursuing. And my sense would then be that the positive visions of the sort that I was describing that we push against, they are inescapable. And it's a matter of which one we have, it's not a matter of whether we will have, and so they may be matters and ought to be matters of debate. And if you follow somebody like Michel Foucault in his later work, he emphasized that even the concept of autonomous subject is not, it hasn't fallen from the sky or hasn't grown simply out of the facts of humanity, qua humanity. It's been created. And it's been created by kind of various social technologies that have brought to the position where we think of ourselves as autonomous subject, with all the benefits and also all the detriments of the conception of itself as an autonomous subject. And so that, I think, becomes a matter of debate rather than simple assumptions that that's how we are going to, that's the kind of natural way to live human life. So those are the first part, a bit of introductory comments, and now I want to introduce you to an acronym. If some of what I've said in the previous what 20 minutes or so that I spoke, something like that, is true, then I think what we are facing today is variety of religions and our religious positions come to us. We encounter them as what I call contending particular universalisms, or CPUs for short. Contending particular universalisms. And I'd like to explicate to you a bit each of these words that make up the phrase, and then pose a question: how in a world or how in a polity of contending particular universalisms we can live together in peace. So, contending particular universalisms. Okay. So first, let's take a term, universalism. Those of you who've done a little bit of Christian study in Christian theology, you might think of universalism as referring to whether only some people will go to heaven, to use a colloquial terminology, or everybody would go to heaven. And universalism is a belief that notwithstanding our behaviors and patterns of convictions, everybody is going to end up saved. Everybody is going to be in heavenly glory. I don't use universalism in this sense. It's not even whether all people will come to embrace a particular position, but it describes positions that claim to be true for all human beings, right? Not whether all human beings actually embrace them, but whether they claim to be true for all human beings. And some such universalisms, in my sense of that term, are secular, like philosophy of Nietzsche or psychology of Freud. Other are more religious, like Christianity and Islam. And still others are somewhere in between. Can't quite tell whether they're religion in the classical sense which we use, whether there is a such classical sense might be a contested question. But there may be something between philosophy and religion. We don't know what Buddhism is, right? In those classical categories, how we use religion. Is it religion or is it not? Is Confucianism a religion or not? Plato's philosophy may be also such from the philosophical end, or Spinoza might be from the philosophical end, something like that. But they contain all, I would contend. They all contain what their adherents consider to be universally valid claims about nature of reality. They can be articulated in mythological, metaphysical, and scientific terms about the self and social relations and the good, about the character of the flourishing life that fits these, and about proper means of accessing this. Kind of epistemology that's part and parcel of this is also a very important aspect. And yesterday we talked briefly about soft relativism. I consider that to be also a one particular position, rather than simply, which might seem strange, rather than simply being a position that everybody can choose whatever they might want, or something of that sort, a very popular way of putting it. to let each person do their own thing? How could that be a universalism, you might want to ask? But the soft relativism, letting each person do her own thing without subjecting their values to criticism, that's a moral, understood today as a moral obligation of each person that is being placed upon also social relations in general, so that it's a moral vision, so that intolerance ends up being sin according to that position that cannot be tolerated. And these convictions presuppose who the self is. It presuppose what's the nature of social relations, presuppose what is the good. And this is not, I'm not mentioning this simply to say this is wrong. I'm simply mentioning it to identify it as one instance of a universalism that's present, and maybe that it's livable in some ways, and other ways it may be limited. And that's, in a sense, how I want to think about religious traditions and non-religious traditions together. Engaged in common search for truth, or as we think about it, as truth-seeking conversations. And truth-seeking is important because religions matter to the extent that they matter in our lives, that they're consequential in terms of how we live. They often articulate our ultimate values. Ultimate values is what our lives are ultimately carried by. And in that sense, contention isn't about religions. But in that sense, contention is always about truth of my own human existence, about what it means to succeed, not simply in one or the other endeavor by which we secure resources, but what does it mean to succeed as a human being? Now that may be a strange way of putting things, but I think it's absolutely fundamental. And it's to our detriment that we don't tend not to think in those terms, that in fact we can fail in life. That's a very uncomfortable thing to say. I remember I was recently talking and I mentioned that idea to an audience. Maybe my mistake was that I mentioned it without carefully preparing it in the audience of folks who were slightly older than I am, most of their lives having already passed. And then when you mention the possibility of human failure, right? It comes very close to our lives, more life of our lives we have lived. But according to all these traditions, I think that's quite possible. And we deceive ourselves if we think that actually in our own lives it isn't possible. But that's about condemning the truth about ourselves and our own existence. I think where contention for truth becomes also significant is how do we organize a common space together. And I think my sense there is that we have to have both a particular political practice or philosophy, political philosophy, which would give equal value to every human being and equal voice to every human being, irrespective from what tradition and what perspective they come. There's also a need for inner transformation of those religious traditions themselves, or of asking the following question. Do these traditions have internal resources to contend in a creative, constructive way rather than in a destructive way? What are those resources, and to kind of craft the traditions? And traditions are craftable. They can be crafted and ought to be crafted. They in fact are crafted so that people can in fact then live out of their own values in a peaceful way, rather than seeing always imposition of peace as a compromise of the positions that they would be otherwise taking. You end up in a position of fairly widespread sense of oppressiveness of a regime, right? If you want to simply impose a political regime on contention, a lot of people, if they don't resonate put it, will feel themselves as oppressed. So for the sake of both the social peace, but also for individual traditions, we need to look for internal resources as well as for kind of external frameworks how to do that. I mean, it's a challenge that's present in many of our universities and colleges as well. How do we create proper space where articulation of contending visions of flourishing life is encouraged and possible? Right? It's not always easy, especially not always easy in today's climate, right? Where certain things cannot or ought not to be said. What things ought not to be said? What things can be said? How contention ought to occur? How contention ought not to occur? That is a kind of political question that we have before us today, but it's also, in many ways, a religious question. Certainly with Islam and Christianity and Judaism, maybe other traditions as well. So that it becomes a question addressed to each tradition internally, how to imagine itself, how to imagine a common space, and then how to also pursue education together. And that brings us to where you most concretely are. One of the reasons we teach course Life Worth Living is to model in the classroom what it means to take seriously truth claims of these traditions, and yet do so in a space that is respectful. So that's the condition of the conversation. You can say anything you want, but you just got to respect another person, and you've got to be willing to have things said to you as well, and not just to claim a freedom for yourself without granting the same freedom to another person. And there's kind of refereeing that's necessary, but that refereeing is a way of negotiating, teaching ourselves how to engage with what is most important, I believe, in our lives, and yet what we skirt around because we can't quite name or can't quite name in a way that wouldn't leave us wounded and maybe uncertain. I think I will stop here, and it was about 45 minutes of, I don't want to treat you to the kind of talks that I received when I was growing up. I grew up in communist country. And if you had a 3-hour talk by politicians, you're lucky, right? And toward the end of, you know, people would obviously fall asleep. Just, who wants to listen? How in 5 years we're going to overcome the rotten capitalists, right? This is a kind of roughly always the subtext of the speech, and pretty soon nobody wanted to hear any of that stuff, and everybody kind of fall asleep. And but toward the end, before the collapse of communism, there was cartoonists were always treading on the edge of things and social critique. There was a cartoon where the speaker himself had fallen asleep. So before I fall asleep, I think I should end. Thank you very much.
If you're willing, we might have some time for questions and conversation. So if you have things that you'd like to talk about with Professor Volf, now's your opportunity.
Okay, there's your opportunity.
I actually have a question. You know, your distinction between truth and absolute truth.
Yeah.
Does it run at all parallel to another distinction that I hear you making, I think, between truth maybe as, you know, fact or propositional claim, and truth as a way of living? Did I hear that? Did I hear a little bit of that distinction between what you're saying?
I think that there is a connection between two of these claims in terms of absoluteness versus kind of provisionality of truth claims. I think most of our truth claims that we make, maybe some are accepted, but most of them that we make have a certain degree of provisionality. Say, philosophy of science will tell you something of that sort as well. Hypotheses, even the strongly established hypotheses have certain sense of provisionality, and the goodness of there being this provisionality is built into the scientific method itself as a way in which science progresses, right? Kind of scientific learning is predicated on this sense of non-absoluteness, non-closedness of a system, and I think that's true. Even in that domain, I think it becomes a kind of non-absoluteness, a kind of sense of kind of firm provisionality becomes important also when it comes to the truth of our lives. It's a slight different order, not completely disconnected, but different order of truth, and it both matters that it's not absolute and that it is relatively firmly embraced, right? And there's kind of a suppleness of the grip on these epistemic goods are particularly important, I think, when it comes to our daily life. If it's true, say, for the Christian faith is about, I'll say it in Augustine's terms, what I ultimately trust and what I ultimately love. The two questions, and I think generally that's probably two questions to ask yourself of your own life. What do you ultimately trust? And what do you ultimately love? Right? Now, the ultimate trusts, it's tough to do it simply as a flip of coin. It has its uncertainty, because obviously uncertainty is that we cannot predict future at all. There are certain uncertainties about language, because they're language about realities that we do not have immediate access to, like the realities of God. But there's also, we don't know what future holds. And any statement of hope is a provisional, by the very character, a provisional kind of statement. It's a statement into unknown. It's a statement with a certain degree of trust. So I have to entrust myself to something and then walk my life, sort of bet my entire existence on the rightness of this choice. And that's why in religious traditions people speak about something that you can trust in life and in death. And it needs to carry. And in that sense, it's very important for it to be experienced as firm. At the same time, it's provisional. It cannot be absolute. It's open for surprise, and partly it's provisional because life goes in so many different directions, and it needs to catch you no matter where your life ends up being. So it's, yeah.
So it sounds like you're conceptualizing a way of thinking about truth that makes possible this open space that involves a kind of trust together as well, and a kind of hope and provisionality in this shared space as well.
And I think this is absolutely essential element of any claim to truth in the kind of existential context, if you want. Because you have to, I mean, even for me to make this step involves a certain small degree of trust, right? That my leg's gonna not crumble, or that something's not gonna crumble underneath. Right? So trust is ineliminable from human life, but especially if you project yourself into something, if you start working toward something and living your life in a particular way. A kind of existential trust is important, and it's important even in traditions which have a way of seeking to redeem the past. And Nietzsche says, to redeem the past, that alone do I call redemption. Because lived lives somehow have to be returned to its rightness, so that my entirety of my life I can feel as my own. and embrace the fullness of it.
So you said one of the conditions for various communities to talk about the contestations of universal goods for like was all voices have to be at the table. So I'm thinking, right now there's controversy at the University of Chicago about a speaker who's been invited, and many people are saying that voice should not be allowed. White nationalism, for instance, should not be allowed. We don't have to support that on our campus. And I think that's a relevant example of if interfaith is going to get together, and it means these kinds of voices as well that are claiming to be universal truths. So how do you deal with those kinds of situations?
Well, yeah. I mean, stepping slightly back from white nationalism and a situation in which we immediately find ourselves with a kind of far-right rhetoric, a situation that's very present in Europe that touches also on the questions of Holocaust, and Holocaust deniers, number of situations of this sort. I think they're slightly different than the kind of broad religious perspective, but they're analogous. And I think that itself, that there are modes of speech that cannot be allowed because they aren't just speech; they are kind of immediate forms of harm, right? Or inciting to harm. I think that should be given. What isn't clear is where the line ought to be drawn. And I think the debate about where to draw the line has to be carried on. And I think it has to be carried on afresh all the time. You cannot settle it for good and then think you have decided the matter, partly because the situation changes, cultural changes, sensibility of cultures. What constitutes harm partly changes. How harm is ensued changes. And so I think these kinds of discussions have to be part and parcel of how to manage that space. I'm not sure that I'm ready to draw the line at this point, but I'm fairly convinced that the line needs to be, lines can be drawn. I mean, it's obviously a discussion with Islam as well. Not so much maybe in this country, but in other parts. Blasphemy laws are a mode of curtailing free speech, right? That touches immediately upon religious traditions. I mean, I happen to think that this is a huge mistake to have something like blasphemy laws. But I think if you're to structure a common space, say in a Muslim country where freedoms were for people of different faiths to live under a common roof, this would have to be a very serious discussion. And it might look a little bit different there than it looks here, as it has looked differently 100 years ago in this country. Or as it has looked, God forbid that we look back to the Pilgrims and try to adjust our visions of social, political order according to them, but certainly has been there, very important and very pernicious stricture on free speech. Yes.
I just wanted to say I was in Indonesia last spring, and that was in Jakarta where they had those blasphemy laws.
Yep.
Actually, they were originally made to prevent discord.
Yeah.
Because you had to silence people so they couldn't say nasty things. And so that was originally, okay, the president was very multicultural, but he put those in place to make it a more interfaith climate. And then the question would be, is that still functional? Or should they, change that or something? Anyway, that's very particular in Indonesia right now.
Yeah, you can do it sometimes depending on circumstances to prevent discord, but you have to know that you're creating it as well by doing it, right?
And it might change.
And
the
so,
culture's
yeah,
changing.
yeah.
Prior to where that line is drawn, wherever it is, I wonder if you have any thoughts on a situation in which people are having a conversation, some of them acknowledge the provisionality of the truth claims they're making, whereas others don't. And how to negotiate those sort of situations, where is it appropriate for those who again acknowledge their provisionality to sort of challenge the other side on that, or
Yeah.
is it where does the respect, aspect
Yeah.
come in there?
Yeah, but my sense of the truth claims that there is respect in respectful challenge of any truth claim, right? It's kind of respecting the person without necessarily respecting the position. I think that's basically how I think about it, which is tied to the larger and controversial issues of respecting a person or affirming a person, but not in their behavior always. Right? And that can be also, the lines can be drawn in such a way that I disagree what kind of behavior ought to be respected and what kind of behavior cannot be respected, right? But I think the debate shouldn't be whether we should make a distinction between person and their acts, whether they're speech acts or their moral acts. It's tough to know exactly how much one should push. For instance, should one engage in fundamentalists who don't think of their positions as provisional, but nonetheless are happy to engage the question of truth of positions? And my position is absolutely yes. And so what's at play also is whether there is provisionality in the claims or not, and as long as the person is willing to discuss that, I'm happy to engage. Where it becomes more difficult is if you have a kinds of fundamentalisms, which you often do have, especially in a highly conflicted situation, where even possibility of entertaining an alternative position is already a crack in the wall. Even imaginatively placing oneself and debating a question seems like a compromise that has been made. And we have situations of that sort, and I'm not sure exactly what to say to folks like that. I had folks like that in my audience, especially after I wrote a book on Allah. And I argued that Muslims and Christians worship the same God, differently understood. And you can just see people in the audience. They're stiff like this, and there are darts coming from their eyes at me. And during my entire speech, and I know that they're going to ask the question, and it's going to not be a question. It's going to be a completely closed, kind of position statement about the issue. I think I myself think to the extent that they're violent, I have to be understanding and tolerant toward the view, but disagree strenuously. In fact, my experience was I have a very close friend of mine who I know likes me, who appreciates me as an intellectual and as a Christian. When I told her that I'm working on this book, The Muslims and Christians Who Worship the Same God, and I told her what my position was, she was completely unporous. It didn't matter at all who I was. This is like telling me that the earth is flat. There's no discussion. Here you're crazy. It just isn't so. And so we deal with situations like this.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. Please join me in thanking